Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting that last question brings us to the issue of urgency and why this is pressing. When we had this bill before us in the spring, before we adjourned and before COVID took over our parliamentary process, until we had the process now, for which I am grateful to all of the parties in this House, that allows us to debate controversial legislation, to have votes at a distance, to respect the threat of COVID and to protect public health. In debating this bill at that time before we adjourned due to COVID, I was getting emails in the House as I debated from one of my best friends who was dying with ALS. And she said, do you think there's any chance? Are you going to get the changes to the bill through for advance directives in time to help me? I deeply, deeply regret that we were unable to get this bill passed last spring when my friend Angela Rickman could have benefited from having access to medical assistance in dying. She died in situations of suffering, which could have been and would have been her wish to avoid. And now, as we debate this, a member of my own family is looking at can we get this bill through quickly enough so that they're not put in the impossible situation in which Audrey Parker found herself. And I will reflect further on Audrey Parker. So there is urgency, whether driven by courts or by compassion, by knowing as legislators, as our friend from Beaches, East York just commented a few speeches back, that we have at this point repeatedly passed legislation that didn't meet the judicial thresholds and frameworks that have been set before us to ensure that the legislation we passed on medical assistance in dying would meet previous court decisions. Now, I know everybody is deeply affected by their own constituents, their own personal experience, their frameworks of religious traditions or lack thereof, but we all come to this, I hope, open-hearted and recognizing that this is a crucially important issue, one that I hope our Parliament will handle better than we have in the past and make sure that we pass legislation that does meet the constitutional requirements that have been put before us, if for no other reasons that we don't have to continually return to improve our legislation and ensure it meets the bar that was set for us by our courts. That has to be paramount. Now, I happen to come from a constituency where overwhelmingly constituents have wanted to see medical assistance in dying legalized for many years. My colleagues in the chamber and watching remotely will remember the name Sue Rodriguez. Sue Rodriguez was a resident of this constituency of North Saanich within Saanich Gulf Islands. Her first effort, and she, of course, the case Sue Rodriguez brought forward was the first time that we had the Supreme Court of Canada ruling by a very narrow margin that it would not be allowed in Canada to have medical assistance in dying. That was back in 1993. And it was by a vote of 5-4 that the Supreme Court denied her final wish. She was able to access illegal assistance from a doctor who remains unknown, but God bless him. But Sue Rodriguez was able to achieve medical assistance in her own death in 1994, February of 1994. And it was not a situation that one would want any of our loved ones to find themselves unable to find the legality of the help and to choose and to find someone willing to help her. The next set of cases, of course, bring us to the more recent cases, the ones we talk about in Parliament today. The one that brought us to Bill C-14 in the previous Parliament, brought forward after the 2015 election. The names of the ministers who were involved have been referenced several times, the Honourable Member for Vancouver-Granville, and of course the former Minister of Health, Jane Philpott. I lamented then in this place that the Carter decision of the Supreme Court of Canada was not being respected fully in the legislation that we were debating. I was able, in clause by clause before committee, to bring forward amendments. They were rejected there to do away with the requirement that someone be capable and competent on the day of the procedure to confirm their desire for medical assistance in dying. It's that requirement that drove Audrey Parker to have to take her own life earlier, not take her own life, achieve medical assistance in dying before the moment when she really wanted to, for fear that she would be unable to provide that consent through the vagaries of the disease or through the pain-killing drugs one way or another. We know Audrey Parker's story. It was related to us today earlier by the current member for Markham-Stouffville and by the member for Dartmouth, who knows the Audrey Parker story well. She died November 1st, 2018, nearly 2 years ago, again saying that this Parliament had let her down through the requirement that you be competent the day of the procedure to confirm that this is indeed your wish. This was impractical. Even as we did that in the Parliament on Bill C-14, we knew from the language in the Carter decision of the Supreme Court of Canada that this was a violation of patients' constitutional rights. When the bill got to the Senate, I was very pleased that the amendments I'd put forward in clause by clause that had been rejected in the House were taken up and approved by the Senate. But as we'll recall, when the bill came back from the Senate, the government rejected the amendments to deal with ensuring that people would have access to medical assistance in dying, and it would have and to deny patients the access to an advance directive. So predictably, here we are, as many of us argued in the Parliament in that first round of debates on Bill C-14 on medical assistance in dying. We were not, as a Parliament, passing legislation that was likely to survive a court challenge. And it wasn't much prescience or crystal ball gazing to know it. You knew it if you read our legislation and compared it to the reasoning in the Carter decision. So here we are now with the new decision, the Chonchon decision from the Quebec Superior Court, and we're going back to amend the legislation. Now, what we're doing, of course, is to make sure that someone in a situation where they do face a terminal illness, their doctors do know that they can't survive this illness, they'll be able to access an advance directive. And again, this was the Carter decision, full square of the Carter decision was facing irremediable suffering. You could access medical assistance in dying. We have clearly in this legislation said that mental illness is not going to be covered. Mental health issues will not be considered an illness, which can be considered irremediable in the context of this legislation. We are very likely to have to come back and revisit that. But certainly, as this legislation goes forward from this vote at second reading to committee, I hope we will find a way to amend the legislation to remove the 90-day timeline around assessing someone's irremediable state of suffering. And again, I support what the member for Beaches East York has said on this. It does not appear at all to be a humane decision or within what the courts have already told us to insist on that 90-day period. Now, some of the things that have been argued today in this House, and I do want to draw attention to them because I would hate for Canadians to think that this bill was as cavalier as some would have us believe. Some have said that this bill allows for death on demand, was one phrase used by one honorable colleague. I think it's important to know that the bill does not at any point say that you can't, it says quite the contrary. And one of my friends in the House has said, well, this bill doesn't make any effort to allow someone to change their mind if at the day of the procedure they've changed their mind. I urge colleagues to look at section 3 sub 1 sub D. It's very clear, and also 3.2, 3.4, 3.5. Throughout the bill, there are many points at which it's very clear that people have the ability to say, and that the doctors have the requirement to verify, that people have the ability, even on an advance directive, to subsequently change their mind. That's a very, very clear set of provisions in the legislation, and that goes, as I said, particularly through the subsections of Section 3, that just to clarify again, 3 sub 1 sub D, I'm just pulling up my copy of the bill, Mr. Speaker. But it's very clear that you have to ensure that the person has been informed that they may at any time and in any manner withdraw their request. That context, that is throughout this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, I know my time is at an end. I just wanted to say I support this bill. I hope we pass it as quickly as possible. People are suffering and they want us to act.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the former Leader of Green Party's comments on the legislation. And it is important for us to recognize, back in 2015, shortly after the election, one of the challenges that we had to do was to come up with new legislation dealing with medical assistance in dying. And I think there was a general feeling that, yes, here we are at this particular point, but we will have to make some changes. And today, that's exactly what it is that we're doing now, given it's primarily being driven because of a court decision in the province of Quebec. My question to the member is if she could just provide some further thoughts in regards to the dropping of the 10-day waiting period for people that are near death.
Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And I thank the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. The legislation is clear. Nothing happens in the blink of an eye. A lot of consideration must be given to the situation of each individual patient. The medical experts who are engaged must have specific knowledge of whatever particular irremediable condition is being raised. The question of eliminating a 10-day waiting period is not to make it on demand. There are still very significant stipulations and requirements that must be assessed and considered in advance of accepting that this is a case for medical assistance in dying.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Mission Matsqui, Fraser Canyon.
I'd like to thank the honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands for her speech this evening. One of the, like a lot of members of Parliament, I consulted my constituents extensively on Bill C7. And one area of commonality that everyone seemed to share was that the Government of Canada, we collectively as Parliament, as legislatures, can do more for people to have more options when they reach a period in their life when death is foreseeable. What would the member say about providing more supports for palliative care to give people that option? Because we do know in many communities across Canada that option just isn't there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I thank my honourable friend from Mission Matsqui, Fraser Canyon. Absolutely. It's not either or. It's absolutely the case that we need to do far more in ensuring, and this, of course, is provision of health care being provincial, but the federal government has responsibilities under the Canada Health Act, and there is, of course, federal-provincial cost sharing around health care. We should absolutely make it a priority that we improve access to palliative care across Canada. And so I completely agree. I resist when I hear some of my honourable colleagues suggesting that this government has a preference for pushing people towards medical assistance in dying. That is not the case. That needs to be understood. We need both.
Questions and comments? The member for Jonquière. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to simply come back to what has just been said. I don't know if my colleague would agree with me to say that we must make a distinction between palliative care and medical assistance in dying. Palliative care falls under health care, and if we want better palliative care, the best recourse is to increase health care funding, which goes to the provinces. In the past, under Liberals and Conservatives, both made cuts to health care. Maybe my colleague would agree with me that if we want better palliative care, we need to improve health care in general and fund it better too. Yes, I completely agree with my colleague from the Bloc Québécois. We have to increase the service level within our public healthcare system, and at the same time, we must amend the criminal code in order to improve medical assistance in dying.
Just for a very short question, we'll take one from the honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
I'd like to thank my colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands for her speech, and I'm glad she brought up the history of Bill C-14 in the previous parliament and the concerns that she and all of us in the NDP shared that this bill did not match the findings of the court decision that brought us to deal with that. And I'm just wondering, she did mention the 90-day period, and I'm just wondering if she could maybe expand on that and what she thinks this is for, because people are in intolerable suffering. Asking them to wait another 3 months seems to be completely, well, it's just not right.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Yeah, perhaps my analysis back from C-14, and this may be right or it may be wrong, but it seemed to me that the country's doctors were in a discussion and dispute with the country's lawyers, and the lawyers were looking at it from the point of view of what meets what the courts have required of us, and the doctors were saying, I don't know how I want to administer this. And at that point, I think we let down individual human beings across Canada. I don't think we should do it again. I think the 90-day period is an arbitrary, bureaucratic response to trying to find the balance points between those competing interests. I think what we should be always thinking about, what should be paramount, is respecting the rights of individual Canadians at the point that they are in irremediable suffering, as confirmed by their physicians.
Resuming debate.